The summons arrived with all the warmth of a tax audit and twice the sense of impending doom. Dr. Alexei Torin read it 3 times, hoping that somehow the fourth reading would reveal it was actually a joke, possibly sent by a colleague with a terrible sense of humor. It remained deeply unamusing. You are hereby requested to appear before Colonial Governor Castellan regarding matters of interstellar diplomatic necessity. Requested. That was political code for you have no choice, but we're pretending you do to maintain the illusion of democracy. Alexei closed his lab workstation, ignored the protein synthesis analysis that was finally showing promising results, and headed to the governor's office with the resigned air of someone walking toward scheduled dental surgery. New Cascadia's administrative center tried very hard to look impressive and mostly succeeded at looking expensive. Marble imported from Earth at costs that could have funded Alexei's research for a decade. Holographic displays showing the colony's achievements in glowing data visualizations. Flags from both human territories and the Velrosian Confederacy hanging in careful balance. Governor Castellan's office was on the top floor, because of course it was. The governor herself waited behind a desk that had probably cost more than Alexei's annual salary, flanked by advisors whose expressions suggested this meeting would be exactly as pleasant as he'd feared. "Dr. Torin," Castellan said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "thank you for coming. I didn't realize I had a choice, Governor." "You don't, but thanking you maintain civility." She gestured to a chair. "Please sit. This will take some time." Alexei sat, noticing the Velrosian diplomatic observer in the corner, a male Velrosian whose luminescent skin flickered through neutral blues, whose tapered ears rose alertly, whose presence meant this wasn't just human business. "Dr. Torin, you're aware that our alliance with the Velrosian Confederacy has been strained recently. I read the news feeds. Failed trade negotiations, resource disputes, the usual diplomatic theater." "It's more serious than theater," one of the advisors interjected. "If the alliance collapses, New Cascadia loses access to Velrosian medical technology, trade routes, and defensive support. Our economy would crater. Our security would be compromised. I'm a xenobiologist, not an economist or diplomat. I'm not sure how I can help with trade negotiations." Castellan and her advisors exchanged glances. The Velrosian observer's luminescence shifted slightly, anticipation or amusement. Alexei couldn't tell which. "Are you familiar with the binding protocol in our original settlement treaty with the Confederacy?" Castellan asked. Alexei's stomach sank. "Vaguely. It's an archaic clause about marriage bonds creating legal ties. Nobody's invoked it in decades. The Confederacy invoked it 2 days ago." Castellan pulled up a holographic display showing the relevant treaty sections. "To preserve the alliance, a formal marriage bond must be established between a human and a Velrosian of sufficient rank to create binding legal obligations." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "You're joking," Alexei said. "I've never been more serious. You're telling me that to save the alliance, someone has to marry a Velrosian, and you've summoned me here because—" The implications caught up with his mouth. "Oh no, absolutely not. Dr. Torin, you've spent a decade researching cross-species compatibility. You understand Velrosian biology, culture, and legal frameworks better than any other human on New Cascadia. You're the only viable candidate. I'm a researcher. I study cellular interactions and protein compatibility, not," he gestured wildly, "not political marriage bonds." "Your research is precisely why you're qualified," the advisor said. "The bond requires biological and cultural compatibility to be legally recognized. You meet both criteria." The Velrosian observer spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the melodic accent common to his people. "The Confederacy has selected Lady Aerith Savan as their representative. She is a diplomatic officer from House Savan, highly educated, experienced in interspecies relations. Your match has been deemed suitable by both parties. Suitable, Alexei repeated, like furniture or laboratory equipment. Think of it as a diplomatic assignment with unusual personal requirements, Castellan said. I think of it as involuntary lifelong commitment to a political stranger. Alexei stood. Find someone else. Anyone else. I'm refusing. If you refuse, the alliance collapses. New Cascadia loses 40% of its economy overnight. Thousands lose their jobs. Medical supplies become scarce. Our defensive agreements vanish. Castellan's voice hardened. Your refusal would doom this colony to economic crisis and potential military vulnerability. That's not fair. You're holding the entire colony hostage to force my compliance. Yes, Castellan said simply, because the alternative is worse for everyone. Alexei sank back into his chair, trapped by implications he couldn't ethically escape. And if I agree to this insanity, the ceremony occurs in 1 week. You and Lady Aerith will establish shared residence as required by the bond. Both of you will gain veto authority over major decisions affecting the alliance, a mechanism designed to force cooperation through shared accountability. Neither government can act against the other's interests without both partners agreeing. So I become a political checkpoint who happens to share living space with a Velrosian diplomat I've never met. Essentially, yes. Alexei laughed, a sound without humor. This is the worst way anyone has ever proposed marriage in human history. Probably, the advisor agreed, but it's what we have. The Velrosian observer approached, offering a data crystal. Information about Lady Aerith, the bond's legal structure, and Velrosian marriage customs. You have 1 week to prepare. She is reviewing similar materials about you and human partnership traditions. Alexei took the crystal like it might explode. Does she want this? No, the Velrosian said honestly. She was selected for political necessity, as were you, but she will fulfill her duty as we trust you will fulfill yours. After they released him, because imprisonment was essentially what this was, Alexei returned to his quarters and inserted the data crystal into his personal terminal. Lady Aerith Savin's file appeared. Diplomatic officer, specialist in trade negotiations, member of one of the Confederacy's influential houses. Her official image showed a Velrosian woman whose luminescent skin shimmered in formal blue tones, whose tapered ears were adorned with traditional rank markers, whose expression was professionally neutral in that way that revealed nothing. She was objectively striking. She was also a complete stranger he was being forced to legally bind himself to. Alexei read through the bond's requirements: shared residence, joint authority over alliance decisions, legal obligations spanning at least 5 years with dissolution requiring approval from both governments. It was designed to be difficult to escape, forcing both parties to actually make it work rather than just enduring until they could separate. The marriage customs section made his head hurt. Velrosian traditions were complex, formal, and involved levels of symbolic gestures that required cultural context he didn't have. His terminal chimed with an incoming message. Secure channel, Velrosian protocols. He accepted, and Lady Aerith Savin appeared on his screen. She looked exactly like her official image but with luminescence shifted toward cooler, professional tones. Dr. Torin, she said formally, I thought we should speak before the ceremony. Lady Aerith. Alexei tried for diplomacy and settled for honesty. I assume you're as thrilled about this as I am. I'm a diplomatic officer. Thrilled isn't part of my emotional repertoire. Her expression remained neutral. But no, I wasn't hoping to have my partnership status determined by political necessity. At least we're starting from a foundation of mutual resentment. That's something. Was that almost a smile? Her luminescence flickered briefly warmer before returning to professional cool. I propose we establish clear expectations, Aerith said. This is a legal arrangement designed to force governmental cooperation. Neither of us chose it, but we can choose how we manage it. professional distance while fulfilling legal obligations. Precisely. We share space as required. We coordinate on alliance decisions as mandated, but we don't pretend this is anything beyond political expedience. That works for me, Alexei agreed. No false romance, no performance of affection we don't feel. Just two people trapped in an absurd situation making the best of it. Agreed. Aerith's shoulders relaxed slightly had she been tense. The ceremony is in 6 days. I'm required to arrive on New Cascadia 3 days prior for cultural acclimation. Perhaps we should meet beforehand to discuss logistics. Sure. I'll show you around the colony. You can tell me which Velrosian customs I'll accidentally violate, and we can both practice not looking like we're being marched to execution. This time Aerith definitely almost smiled. An efficient use of time. I'll contact you when I arrive. The communication ended, and Alexei stared at the blank screen. 1 week until he married a woman he just met through forced political arrangement. His grandmother would have been absolutely horrified, or possibly amused. She'd had a dark sense of humor about life's absurdities. Alex returned to his lab the next morning and found his research partner, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, already reviewing the protein synthesis results. You look like you've received catastrophic news, Yuki observed. Did funding get cut again? Worse, I'm getting married. Yuki's expression cycled through confusion, surprise, and concern in rapid succession. To whom? You haven't dated anyone in 3 years. To Lady Aerith Savan of the Velrosian Confederacy, for political reasons, in 6 days. I'm going to need significantly more context. Alexei explained the situation, the failing alliance, the treaty clause, the forced marriage bond. Yuki listened with increasing disbelief. They can't actually force you to marry someone, Yuki said finally. They can't force me, but they can collapse the colony's economy if I refuse, which amounts to the same thing with extra guilt. That's, Yuki searched for words. Incredibly manipulative and probably traumatic. Yeah, well, apparently interstellar politics doesn't care about consent when alliances are at stake. Alexei pulled up his research files, trying to focus on work instead of impending doom. At least I'm marrying a diplomat. Maybe she'll be good at negotiating which side of the bed I get. You're making jokes, that means you're terrified. I'm making jokes because I'm terrified, and humor is cheaper than therapy. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation, learning Velrosian marriage customs, reviewing the bond's legal framework, and trying to finish enough research work that his forced sabbatical from the lab wouldn't completely derail his projects. Lady Aerith arrived on schedule, her shuttle touching down at New Cascadia's main spaceport with appropriate diplomatic ceremony. Alex watched from a distance as Governor Castellan performed official greetings and Velrosian dignitaries exchanged formal pleasantries. They'd arranged to meet privately afterward at a neutral location, a cafe in the colony's central district that served both human and Velrosian refreshments. Alexei arrived first and ordered coffee that tasted like anxiety with caffeine enhancement. He was reviewing bond documentation on his datapad when Aerith entered, flanked by a single attendant who positioned himself at a respectful distance. In person, without the flattering angles of official images or communication screens, Aerith Savan was still striking. Her luminescent skin shifted through calm blue tones. Her tapered ears moved slightly, tracking sounds in the busy cafe. She wore civilian clothes rather than formal diplomatic attire, an apparent concession to appearing approachable. Dr. Torin, she said, settling into the chair across from him. Lady Aerith, can I order you something? I'm told the Velrosian blend here is actually decent. Please. She studied him with the same assessing gaze he was probably directing at her. You look different than your file image. Older, more tired, generally more resigned to my fate. More human. Official images always make people look like idealized versions rather than actual individuals. The server brought Aerith's beverage, something that steamed gently and smelled like cinnamon mixed with compounds Alex couldn't identify. She sipped it and made a satisfied sound. It is decent, I'm surprised. New Cascadia does try. We're a frontier colony, but we're not complete barbarians. Alexei set aside his datapad. So, 6 days until we're legally bound for a minimum of 5 years. Should we practice small talk or skip straight to discussing how to avoid killing each other? Aerith's luminescence flickered warmer, amusement he'd learned. Your directness is refreshing. Most humans I negotiate with hide intent behind layers of diplomatic courtesy. I'm a researcher, not a diplomat. Directness is more efficient than performance. I appreciate efficiency. She pulled out her own datapad. I've reviewed the shared residence requirements. The quarters provided are adequate but will need modification to accommodate both our needs. I require specific light spectrum for health reasons. You presumably have similar requirements. Mostly I require coffee accessibility and minimal interruption during research binges. Everything else is negotiable. They spent the next hour discussing logistics with the businesslike efficiency of people planning a laboratory project rather than a marriage. Living arrangements, work schedules, shared authority protocols for alliance decisions. It was possibly the least romantic pre-wedding conversation in history. One question, Alexei said as their meeting concluded. The bond gives us veto authority over each other's major decisions. How do we handle disputes when we disagree? Negotiation, presumably. That's the point, forcing both sides to actually communicate rather than acting unilaterally. Aerith's expression was thoughtful. I imagine we'll argue frequently, but productive argument is better than silent resentment. Works for me, I'm good at arguing. I've been trained in diplomatic negotiation since childhood. I suspect I'm better. We'll find out. As Aerith prepared to leave, Alexei found himself asking the question that had been bothering him since the governor's office. Why did they choose you? Out of all Velrosian diplomats, why you specifically? Aerith's luminescence shifted through colors he couldn't quite interpret, something complicated, possibly bitter. Because my family's political position makes me valuable enough that the Confederacy must honor this bond, but expendable enough that if it fails catastrophically, the damage is contained. I'm important but not irreplaceable. I was chosen for similar reasons, Alexei admitted. Important enough that my participation signals genuine commitment, but not so important that my removal would cripple anything critical. We're both pawns in a larger game. Yeah, at least we're pawns together. Aerith's expression softened slightly, not quite a smile, but less professionally neutral. 6 days, Dr. Torin. Try not to flee the planet before then. Same to you, Lady Aerith. She left with her attendant, and Alexei sat alone at the cafe table nursing cold coffee and contemplating the absurdity of his situation. Forced to marry a stranger for political reasons. Required to share his life with someone he barely knew. Trapped by circumstances neither had chosen. It was going to be a disaster. But at least Aerith seemed intelligent, direct, and possessed of a dry humor that suggested she wouldn't make the disaster actively worse. That was something. Maybe. The ceremony was scheduled for midday in New Cascadia's largest diplomatic hall, a space designed to host interspecies events with all the aesthetic compromise that implied. Human architectural elements clashed with Velrosian design preferences, resulting in a room that managed to satisfy nobody while technically accommodating everyone. Alexei stood in a preparation chamber wearing formal attire that combined human and Velrosian ceremonial elements. The result looked like someone had taken 2 different cultures' wedding traditions and forced them into a blender. His collar was too tight. The ceremony coordinator appeared, a harried human woman with a datapad and the expression of someone managing a diplomatic incident disguised as a wedding. Dr. Torin, 5 minutes. Lady Aerith is ready. Alexei followed her through corridors to the ceremonial hall's entrance. Through the doorway, he could see hundreds of attendees, human colonial officials, Velrosian diplomatic corps, media representatives from both sides, and various dignitaries whose presence was required by protocol. Governor Castellan stood at the central dais with a Velrosian high officiate. Both would conduct the ceremony jointly, symbolizing the alliance this marriage was meant to preserve. Then Aerith entered from the opposite side of the hall. She wore formal Velrosian ceremonial robes that shifted color with her movement, traditional but adapted to incorporate human symbolic elements. Her luminescence was carefully controlled, formal blue tones that revealed nothing of her actual emotional state. Her expression was professionally neutral, the diplomatic mask she'd probably perfected over years of negotiations. They approached the dais from opposite sides, meeting at the center in choreography that had been rehearsed exactly once the day before. Alexei had stumbled through his positioning. Aerith had moved with practiced grace. Now they stood face to face, surrounded by witnesses, about to exchange vows neither had chosen. Governor Castellan spoke first. "We are gathered to witness the formation of a marriage bond between Dr. Alexei Torin of Humanity and Lady Aerith Savan of the Velrosian Confederacy. This union creates legal ties that bind our governments to mutual obligation and shared prosperity." The Velrosian high officiate continued in formal Velrosian, translated simultaneously through everyone's personal devices. The bond grants each partner authority over the other's decisions in matters affecting both peoples. It demands communication, compromise, and commitment to mutual success. They proceeded through the required vows, promises of cooperation, pledges of shared responsibility, formal acknowledgement of the bond's legal authority. Alexei spoke his lines with the enthusiasm of someone reciting mandatory safety protocols. Aerith maintained her diplomatic composure throughout. The symbolic exchange came next, human and Velrosian tokens representing the union. Alexei placed a ceremonial bracelet on Aerith's wrist, human tradition adapted for Velrosian physiology. Aerith presented him with a carved crystal that would supposedly glow in response to the bond's activation. Velrosian tradition he didn't fully understand. "By the authority vested in us by our respective governments," Castellan concluded, "we recognize this marriage bond as legally binding. May it strengthen the alliance between our peoples." The hall erupted in polite applause. Media drones captured every angle. Diplomatic observers nodded approvingly. And Alexei stood beside Aerith feeling like he'd just signed a contract he'd spent insufficient time reviewing. The reception was mercifully brief. Neither culture's traditions required extended celebration, and both Alexei and Aerith had made clear they wanted minimal ceremony. They endured congratulations from officials who treated the marriage like a successful trade agreement, answered questions from media who framed it as either romantic breakthrough or desperate political maneuver, and finally escaped to the transport that would take them to their assigned shared quarters. The residence was located in New Cascadia's diplomatic district, an apartment that had been modified to accommodate both human and Velrosian needs. Separate bedroom spaces connected to shared common areas. Lighting systems that could adjust spectrum for Aerith's physiology. Food preparation areas equipped for both diets. It was functional, impersonal, and felt exactly like what it was: government-assigned housing for a political arrangement. They stood in the main living area, still wearing their ceremonial attire, surrounded by luggage and the awkward reality that they now lived together. "Well," Alexei said finally, "this is officially the strangest day of my life, and I once accidentally created a bacteria that smelled like cinnamon and existential dread." Aerith's luminescence flickered warmer, that almost smile again. "I once negotiated a trade agreement while suffering from Velrosian equivalent of food poisoning. This is worse. At least we're suffering together." Comforting, she looked around the apartment. "The space is adequate. I'll need to adjust the bedroom lighting, but overall it meets requirements." I'll try not to be too loud during late-night research sessions. Fair warning, I talk to myself when I'm working through problems. I meditate in the mornings and sometimes practice negotiation scenarios aloud. Fair warning, it might sound like I'm arguing with invisible opponents. They divided the space efficiently, Aerith taking the bedroom with better light access, Alexei claiming the one closer to the workspace he'd requested. They unpacked in silence, establishing territories like animals marking boundaries. That night, Alexei lay in his bed in a room that didn't feel like his, in an apartment he shared with a stranger he'd married for political necessity, contemplating how his life had reached this particular absurdity. Through the walls, he could hear Aerith moving in her own space, quiet sounds of someone else establishing routines in parallel isolation. This was going to be a long 5 years. The first month was an exercise in careful avoidance. They occupied the same space while maintaining maximum distance, communicating only about practical necessities. Morning schedules were coordinated to minimize bathroom conflicts. Meals were taken separately or in silence. They existed in parallel rather than together, two people trapped in legal proximity who'd perfected the art of polite indifference. Alexei returned to his research with the focus of someone using work to avoid thinking about his personal life. The lab became a refuge where things made sense, where problems had solutions based on evidence rather than political expediency. Aerith's diplomatic work kept her equally occupied. She spent long hours in meetings, negotiations, and the endless bureaucratic maintenance required to keep the alliance functioning. They saw each other primarily in passing. Brief encounters in the kitchen, nodded acknowledgments in the living area, occasional status updates about schedule changes. "I'll be working late tonight," Aerith would say. "I have lab work until past midnight," Alexei would respond. "Understood." Noted. It was professionally distant and emotionally sterile, and exactly what they'd agreed to. But proximity has consequences even when you're actively avoiding connection. Alexei noticed things. How Aerith's luminescence shifted to frustrated red tones when she dealt with particularly obstinate Velrosian bureaucrats. The way she organized her workspace with precise efficiency. How she'd sometimes pause at the window in the early morning, watching New Cascadia's sunrise with an expression that suggested homesickness for a world she couldn't return to without failing her duty. He noticed she stayed up too late reviewing documents, that she drank a specific tea blend when stressed, that she had a dry sense of humor about diplomatic absurdities that emerged in occasional muttered comments she probably thought he couldn't hear. Aerith, for her part, noticed that Alexei's cynicism masked something else, that his research notes were filled with margin comments about potential medical applications that could help people, that he'd sometimes talk himself through ethical considerations aloud, arguing with himself about the right approach to problems that had no clear answers. She noticed he worked himself to exhaustion when anxious, that he had surprisingly strong opinions about proper coffee preparation, that beneath his defensive sarcasm was someone who actually cared about things but found caring easier to bear when hidden behind humor. They didn't discuss these observations, but they accumulated, creating awareness despite determined indifference. The first real conversation happened 6 weeks in, triggered by bureaucratic absurdity. Alexei came home from the lab to find Aerith in the living area surrounded by holographic displays, her luminescence cycling through colors that indicated extreme frustration. "Problem?" he asked, intending to continue to his room after brief acknowledgement. "Human colonial resource management has denied my request for trade route optimization that would benefit both species," Aerith said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Their stated reason is insufficient human benefit analysis, which translates to, we prioritize our interests regardless of alliance implications. That's typical bureaucratic short-sightedness. Sorry you're dealing with it." It's not short-sightedness. It's deliberate obstruction by officials who resent Velrosian influence. She looked at him directly for the first time in days. You have authority to override their decision through the marriage bond. Would you review the proposal objectively? Alexei hesitated. This was the first time either had invoked their veto authority. Send me the analysis. He spent an hour reviewing Aerith's proposal, the human department's objections, and the supporting data. The analysis was thorough, the benefits were mutual, and the human department's rejection was based on territorial defensiveness rather than legitimate concerns. He sent his approval through official channels, effectively overriding the department's decision. Aerith appeared at his workspace door. You sided against human officials. I sided with good policy. Their rejection was based on politics, not evidence. I assumed you'd prioritize human interest regardless of merit. You assumed wrong. Alexei leaned back in his chair. Being forced into this bond doesn't mean I have to be dishonest. I can hate the situation and still act with integrity. Her luminescence shifted to surprised blue-green. That's refreshingly principled. Don't sound so shocked. I'm capable of basic ethics. Most humans I negotiate with aren't. They perform ethics while serving ulterior motives. I'm too tired for performance. What you see is what you get, which is mostly cynicism and caffeine dependency, but at least it's honest. Aerith almost smiled. I appreciate honesty. It's rarer than it should be. After that, something shifted. Not friendship yet, but acknowledgement that they were both trapped in this situation, and might as well be trapped honestly rather than through continued performance of indifference. They started having dinner together occasionally, not daily, but often enough that it became routine rather than exception. Conversations remained primarily practical but expanded beyond pure logistics. How is your research progressing? Aerith asked one evening. Slowly. I'm developing treatments for Velrosian cellular degradation that occurs in human-compatible atmospheric conditions. Turns out your biology doesn't love our oxygen-nitrogen ratios long-term. That would explain the chronic fatigue some Velrosian residents experience. Her expression showed genuine interest. Is it solvable? Theoretically, yes. I'm working on a supplement that compensates for the atmospheric incompatibility. Should help Velrosians living on human colonies maintain better health. That would significantly improve quality of life for Velrosian populations here. That's the idea. Medical research that actually helps people rather than just publishing papers nobody reads. Aerith studied him across the dinner table. You care about this work deeply. It's useful. Better than purely theoretical research that never leaves the lab. You can admit it matters to you without diminishing yourself. Alexei looked up from his food. You're very direct. I'm Velrosian. We consider emotional dishonesty wasteful. It must make diplomacy interesting. Diplomacy is performance of emotional dishonesty elevated to art form. It's exhausting. Her luminescence flickered through tired colors. This, speaking plainly without calculation, is relief. They fell into a routine, working separately during the day, but comparing notes in the evening about the absurdities they'd encountered. Aerith would describe bureaucratic obstructions with dry commentary about their strategic stupidity. Alexei would explain research setbacks with dark humor about the universe's apparent opposition to progress. It wasn't friendship yet, but it was companionable, which was more than either had expected. 2 months in, Aerith introduced him to Velrosian strategic games, complex board setups that combined tactical positioning with psychological warfare. Alexei was terrible at them initially, but found himself actually enjoying the challenge. You're improving, Aerith observed after he'd managed to not lose completely. You're thinking 3 moves ahead instead of just reacting. I'm still losing catastrophically, just with more awareness of my impending doom. Awareness is improvement. Most players never develop strategic vision beyond immediate advantage. Alex introduced her to human political satire, literature that translated surprisingly well across species. Aerith's luminescence would shift through amused colors while reading descriptions of bureaucratic absurdity that could have described either government. "This is disturbingly accurate," she said, while reading a particularly biting passage about diplomatic doublespeak. "Good satire always is. That's why people in power hate it. I'm people in power, I love it. You're trapped in an arranged marriage for political necessity. I think that disqualifies you from the category of people who deserve satire." Her luminescence warmed significantly. "Thank you for that distinction." They were developing something neither had anticipated when they'd exchanged those cold, resentful vows. Mutual respect built on honesty rather than performance. It still wasn't friendship, but it was becoming less uncomfortable, which felt like progress. Then came the first real crisis, and everything changed. 3 months into the marriage, a human corporation, TerraCore Resources, announced plans to renegotiate resource extraction rights in ways that would dramatically benefit human interests while devastating Velrosian trade routes. The proposal was legally complex but practically simple. Redirect valuable mineral shipments through human-controlled checkpoints, implementing security measures that would delay Velrosian trade while expediting human corporate interests. It would generate massive profits for TerraCore and significant political support from human constituencies who saw Velrosian trade as competition. It would also undermine the alliance's economic foundation by making cooperation actively disadvantageous for Velrosians. The proposal landed on Alexei's desk through his bond authority. TerraCore's lawyers had assumed he'd automatically support human corporate interests and were shocked when he actually read the full analysis. He spent 3 days reviewing every aspect: economic projections, trade route impacts, long-term alliance implications. The data was clear. TerraCore's proposal was short-term profit maximization that would cause long-term alliance damage. Aerith presented her own analysis, equally thorough, reaching identical conclusions through Velrosian economic frameworks. "This will pass if you don't veto it," she said during one of their evening discussions that had evolved into actual strategy sessions. "TerraCore has significant political support. Human Colonial Council wants to appear pro-human business. They'll approve it unless you intervene. And if I veto it, I'll be accused of prioritizing Velrosian interests over human prosperity. Yes, you'll face significant political backlash from human constituencies who see this as betrayal." Alexei looked at the data one more time. At the evidence showing TerraCore's proposal was exploitative, unsustainable, and designed to maintain short-term profits at the expense of long-term stability. "I'm vetoing it." Aerith's luminescence shifted through surprised colors. "You're certain? The political cost to you personally will be substantial. The cost to the Alliance will be worse. This isn't about human versus Velrosian interests. It's about good policy versus corporate exploitation." He submitted his formal veto through the bond's legal channels. "Besides, I didn't agree to this marriage to rubber-stamp terrible decisions just because they come from my own species. Most humans in your position would prioritize tribal loyalty over objective analysis. Most humans in my position aren't being forced into political marriages, so we're all making unusual choices here." The backlash was immediate and severe. Human media outlets accused Alexei of being compromised by Velrosian influence. Colonial Council members demanded investigations into whether the marriage bond had corrupted his judgment. TerraCore's lawyers filed formal complaints about foreign interference in human economic policy. Governor Castellan summoned him to her office the next day. "Dr. Torin," she said with the carefully controlled tone of someone containing fury, "you've created a political firestorm. Multiple council members are calling for your bond authority to be revoked. On what grounds? I reviewed the proposal objectively and found it harmful to alliance stability." That's exactly what the bond is supposed to enable: objective assessment rather than tribal bias. "You sided against human corporate interests." I sided against exploitative policy that would generate short-term profits while damaging long-term cooperation. If that's controversial, our priorities are severely misaligned. Castellan studied him for a long moment. You genuinely believe the veto was correct? I do. Terracore's proposal was designed to undermine the alliance while appearing to benefit human interests. It would have worked short-term and collapsed long-term. I stopped that collapse, at significant personal cost to your reputation and political standing. I'm a researcher who was forced into political marriage. I didn't have significant reputation or standing to begin with. Alexei met her gaze steadily. I'm using the authority you forced on me to actually do what it's supposed to do. If that's a problem, maybe the problem is the system that expects me to act tribally rather than objectively. Castellan dismissed him without further comment, but her expression suggested she was reconsidering assumptions about his compliance. When Alexei returned to their shared quarters, Aerith was waiting. I heard about the council meeting, she said. News travels fast. You defended the veto publicly. You could have apologized, claimed cultural misunderstanding, preserved your political standing. Instead, you doubled down. Because I was right. I'm not apologizing for being right just because it's politically inconvenient. Aerith's luminescence shifted through complex colors. Respect, surprise, something else he couldn't quite identify. I expected you to collapse under political pressure. Most humans do. I'm stubbornly terrible at collapsing. It's my least endearing quality. I'm beginning to think it's your most valuable one. They fell into silence, but it was different from the careful avoidance of their first month. This was comfortable, companionable, the silence of people who'd fought together and emerged still standing. Thank you, Aerith said finally, for acting with integrity even when it cost you, for seeing past tribal loyalty to actual policy merit, for being. She searched for words, better than I expected. You're welcome. Though setting your expectations at probably terrible makes improvement fairly easy. My expectations weren't probably terrible. They were certainly compromised by human bias. You exceeded that significantly. Alexei found himself almost smiling. I'll take it. Significantly less terrible than anticipated is going on my professional evaluation. That night, they stayed up late discussing the political fallout, strategizing about how to handle continued pressure from both sides. At some point, the conversation shifted from pure strategy to actual connection, sharing experiences, comparing perspectives, finding common ground in their shared resentment of systems that forced them together while expecting tribal loyalty. I was chosen because my family considered me expendable, Aerith admitted. Valuable enough to signal commitment, but not so valuable that my failure would devastate their political position. I'm a calculated risk. Same here. Important enough that my participation matters, but not so important that removing me would cause systemic problems. Alexei refilled their drinks, his coffee, her Valrosian tea blend. We're both political pawns who were supposed to perform our roles without actual agency. Instead, we're developing inconvenient principles and accidentally threatening the systems that deployed us. It's almost satisfying in a catastrophic sort of way. Aerith's luminescence flickered through warm colors. You're strange, Dr. Torin. You're not the first person to mention that, though usually it's phrased as difficult or non-cooperative or my personal favorite, aggressively problematic. I prefer unexpectedly principled. I'll add that to the collection. 3 months into a forced political marriage, sitting across a table from a woman he'd resented being bound to, Alexei realized something unsettling. He was starting to actually like Aerith Savin, not because he had to, not because it was politically expedient, but because beneath the